Citizens Climate Lobby is a grassroots organization that aims to make a carbon fee and dividend into law. Here we'll consider why we should adopt the carbon fee and dividend law that Citizens Climate Lobby proposes. The law has three main components: a carbon fee, a dividend, and a border adjustment. The carbon fee would reduce domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. The dividend would improve the domestic economy. The border adjustment would reduce foreign emissions of greenhouse gases. And the entire package should appeal to both Republicans and Democrats. Consider first how a carbon fee would reduce domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. We can explore this issue by answering three questions. What is a carbon fee? What carbon fee does Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL for short, propose? And what would the carbon fee accomplish? So what is a carbon fee? Here we have Mr. Cole. He owns a coal field in West Virginia. He's thinking about the profits he'll reap when he sells his coal. But along comes Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam tells Mr. Cole that he must pay a fee for any coal that he extracts. Mr. Cole doesn't like this at all, but there's nothing he can do about it. The fee is simple, straightforward, and unavoidable, so he pays. While Mr. Cole stews, let's consider the specific carbon fee that CCL proposes. The fee is paid by anyone who extracts a fossil fuel when the substance is extracted. The fee is proportional to the amount of carbon dioxide that would be created if the extracted substance were used as fuel. The fee starts at $15 per metric ton and increases $10 annually thereafter. So after 10 years, it would be $105 per metric ton, and after 20 years, it would be $205 per metric ton. Looking over the proposal, Mr. Cole decides that he'll just charge more. After all, he thinks, people need what I'm selling. What, then, would the carbon fee accomplish? In order to answer this question, we need to think about the carbon fee from the point of view of various players in the economy, specifically utilities, investors, and competitors. Mrs. Plant runs a public utility. She sees that Mr. Cole plans to charge more, but she has no better option. So, she thinks, I'll have to pay more. Watching this unfold, Mrs. Green, who manufactures solar panels and creates large solar arrays, thinks that she'll soon be able to beat Mr. Cole's price per kilowatt hour. The investor, Mr. Wall, has the very same thought. So, he directs his clients to move some of their money away from coal and into renewables. This allows Mrs. Green to ramp up production so that when she can beat Mr. Cole's prices, she'll have the supply that is required to meet the demand that there will surely be. When the time comes, she calls Mrs. Plant and tells her that she now can beat Mr. Cole's prices. Mrs. Plant then switches her supplier to Mrs. Green. At this point, Mr. Wall tells his clients to drop coal entirely and shift everything into renewables. So, Mr. Cole closes shop. In theory, that's how the carbon fee should impact energy production and consequently reduce domestic emissions of greenhouse gases, by causing us to switch from dirty to clean sources of energy. CCL hired Regional Economics Models Incorporated, also known as REMI, to test this theory. They hired REMI because REMI is nonpartisan and highly regarded. REMI found that the fee wouldn't affect our total energy consumption very much, but it would drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it would change how we generate energy. Let's look at a few of their results. Here we see two possible futures. On the left, we see how energy would be generated over a 30-year period if we continue with business as usual. On the right, we see how energy would be generated over the same 30-year period if we implement CCL's carbon fee. Without the fee, we continue to rely largely on dirty fossil fuels, especially coal and natural gas, depicted here with the lower blues and orange respectively. With the fee, we phase out coal and natural gas, shifting to cleaner alternatives, especially wind and nuclear, depicted here with light green and red respectively. Nuclear energy is very controversial for many reasons. I won't explore pros and cons here, but I will say this. REMI's modeling assumes that we continue with the present regulatory framework for nuclear energy. If we required that nuclear power plants pay the full cost of disposing of their waste, or we required that they purchase unsubsidized insurance to cover the full cost of a meltdown, then nuclear may no longer be cost competitive, in which case it would be replaced by the expansion of solar and other cleaner sources of energy. With this shift in energy generation, we get a significant reduction in domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. The blue line represents emissions if we continue with business as usual. The yellow line represents emissions if we adopt CCL's carbon fee. As you can see, the carbon fee would reduce domestic emissions drastically. The emissions levels in 2035 would be about half of what they were in 1990. This is a commonly recognized target, supported by many scientists, including CCL's most prominent scientific advisor, James Hansen. So, to return to our main question, What would CCL's carbon fee accomplish? We have seen that in theory, the fee would shift energy production to cleaner energy and consequently would reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. We also have seen that REMI confirms this theory, finding specifically that the carbon fee would reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions drastically to below 50% of 1990 levels by 2035. While this is significant, one might wonder what we should do if we need a more drastic reduction. Here we should notice 2 points. First, CCL's policy can be adjusted to fit whatever scientists say we need. The REMI study modeled a fee starting at $10 per metric ton of CO2 and increasing $10 annually thereafter. CCL presently proposes starting at $15 per metric ton, as depicted here. We could have the fee rise more steeply, or start it higher, or have it increase however we need to in order to achieve the desired reduction in emissions. Second, CCL's proposal would reduce emissions more than I have suggested. REMI modeled CCL's proposal under the presupposition that we will not improve any technology at all. They presumed, for example, that solar panels would not become more efficient. They made this presumption not because they believe it, but rather because they wanted to be conservative. But technologies will improve, especially if we incentivize investment by implementing a carbon fee. So, implementing CCL's proposal would reduce emissions to well below 50% of 1990 levels by 2035. We just saw that the carbon fee would drastically reduce domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. Next, consider how the dividend would improve the domestic economy. We can explore this issue by answering 3 questions. What's a carbon dividend? What carbon dividend does CCL propose? And what would the carbon dividend accomplish? What's a carbon dividend? Consider what happens to the money Uncle Sam collects from Mr. Cole. Uncle Sam deposits the money in an account containing all and only money collected through the carbon fee. If Uncle Sam used this money to, for example, build new roads, or subsidize other kinds of energy, or pay the national debt, the money collected would be a tax. The fee is not a tax, however, because Uncle Sam doesn't spend the money. Instead, he gives it to U.S. households. It can be given by lowering taxes, or, as CCL proposes, by sending everyone monthly dividend checks. What specific carbon dividend does CCL propose? 100% of the fee money becomes dividend payments. The payments come monthly to each U.S. household, with 1 share for each adult and 1/2 share for each child up to 2 children. What would the carbon dividend accomplish? Consider first how a carbon fee would impact people's incomes if we didn't have a dividend. In part 1, we met Mrs. Plant, who runs a utility. As the price of energy increases because of the carbon fee, she charges her customers more. Here let's consider how this impacts domestic manufacturers, retailers, and ultimately, ordinary consumers such as Mr. Me. Mr. Me sees that Mrs. Plant now plans to charge more and knows that his electric bill will go up. And it gets worse. Manufacturers also pay more for energy, whether they buy it from Mrs. Plant or create it for themselves. So our shoemaker has to charge retailers more for each pair of shoes in order to make the same profit. So retailers charge end-of-the-line consumers more for each pair of shoes. Seeing that he'll need to pay more for everything he buys, Mr. Me is furious. Here's where the dividend comes in. Uncle Sam takes the money collected through the fee, splits it into equal shares, and delivers Mr. Me a monthly check, containing the share for his family. Since he lives with his wife and children, he receives 3 shares. Mr. Me, seeing his check, realizes that it more than covers the increase in his bills. Does everyone's dividend more than cover the increase in her cost of living that results from the carbon fee? Suppose that only 2 people live in a society with a carbon fee and dividend. Call them rich and poor. Poor spends $510 per month. Rich spends $1,020 per month. If there were no carbon fee, poor would have been able to make the same purchases for $500, and rich would have been able to make the same purchases for $1,000. So, although fossil fuel companies pay the fee directly, poor and rich, in effect, pay a carbon fee indirectly. Specifically, poor indirectly pays a $10 a month fee, and rich indirectly pays a $20 per month fee. So, together, they indirectly pay $30 per month in fees. Fossil fuel companies pay that $30 per month directly to the government. The government splits that $30 per month evenly between poor and rich. So, poor and rich each get a dividend each month of $15. So, since poor only pays a $10 per month fee, he sees a net gain of $5 per month. And since rich pays a $20 per month fee, he sees a net loss of $5 per month. This assessment is based on the presumption that the fee payments that corresponds to one's purchases are exactly proportional to the amount one spends. This won't be exactly right because some goods and services require more energy to produce and to provide than others. It takes a lot less energy to provide a $50 massage than to produce a $50 pair of shoes, for example. Consequently, someone who spends $25,000 per year may pay less in indirect fees than someone who spends $26,000 per year. Nonetheless, the presumption is fair for two reasons. First, someone who spends $25,000 per year typically would pay more in indirect fees than someone who spends $26,000 per year. Second, someone who spends $35,000 per year almost invariably would pay more in indirect fees than someone who spends $25,000 per year. Since poor comes out ahead on the carbon fee and dividend, and rich comes out behind, we should ask, which among us do well? To begin answering this question, consider a society that is more complicated, consisting of 6 people rather than 2. Penny, who spends $500 per month, Paula, who spends $1,000, Missy, who spends $1,500, Mike, who spends $2,000, Mark, who spends $2,500, and Rich, who spends a whopping $50,000 per month. Suppose that roughly 1% of all purchases correspond to fee payments. So, Penny indirectly pays $5 per month in fees, Paula indirectly pays $10 per month in fees, and so on up to Rich, who indirectly pays $500 per month in fees. So, the total of fees collected is $575 per month. The money is split evenly among the 6 members of the society. So, each person gets a $96 per month dividend payment. Since Penny receives more in dividend payments than she pays in indirect fees, she comes out ahead each month, specifically $91 ahead. Paula comes out $86 ahead, and so on up to Mark, who comes out $71 ahead. But Rich comes out $404 behind. This shows something important. Under the carbon fee and dividend, typically, people who spend less than the average amount spent come out ahead, and people who spend more than the average amount spent come out behind. I say typically because there may be exceptions. People who spend more than the average amount spent, but only buy services that take little or no energy to provide and goods that take little or no energy to produce, may come out ahead. But such people are few and far between. Why? Because people who spend a lot typically spend more on cars, houses, clothes, and other goods that take energy to produce than do people who spend very little. We can now return to our question. What would the dividend accomplish? Specifically, how would it impact people's incomes? We just saw that typically people who spend less than the average amount spent come out ahead, and people who spend more than the average amount spent come out behind. In our society, the overwhelming majority of people spend less than the average amount spent. This is because in our society, a minority of very wealthy people have significantly more wealth and make significantly more money than the vast majority of the population, which means that spending in our society is skewed heavily to the top, with the small minority of very wealthy people spending significantly more than the vast majority of individuals. Taken together, these two claims imply that in our society most people come out ahead under CCL's fee and dividend, and the less one spends, the further ahead one will come out. This might sound unfair, as if we're taking money from the rich to give it to the poor. But that's not what we're doing at all. Instead, we're taking money from people to the extent that they are responsible for harmful carbon emissions, and giving the money to everyone, since everyone suffers from climate disruption. We are, in effect, forcing people to take responsibility for harming others. Next, consider how the carbon dividend would impact jobs. What will Mr. Me do with the extra money he gets from the dividend? People spend dividend payments much as they spend tax returns. They spend them on goods and services that are fairly labor-intensive, such as healthcare, housing, and dining out. These purchases require labor to sell the goods and provide the services, so the dividend creates jobs. In theory, that's how the dividend should impact people's incomes in the job market. Remy tested this theory as well. They found that under CCL's carbon fee and dividend, real disposable income increases and labor's share of income increases. This implies that the total income pie gets bigger and labor gets more of the pie than they do now. Remy also found that the carbon fee and dividend causes a significant net gain in jobs. Let's look at some of the specific results. Remy modeled the impact of the carbon fee and dividend by region, breaking the U.S. into 9 regions depicted here. Take a look at the colors for regions that especially interest you because the color coding will be used on the next few slides. I live in Iowa, in the West North Central region, represented here in green. I grew up in Pennsylvania, in the Mid-Atlantic region, represented here in bright yellow, so I'll highlight these regions as we proceed. This slide depicts the cost of living increase by region that's caused by the carbon fee. You can see that the West North Central region would see the cost of living rise by a little over 2% between 2015 and 2035 as a result of the carbon fee, and the Mid-Atlantic region would see the cost of living rise by a little less than 2% over the same period. Now let's look at what the dividend payments would be over those 20 years. This slide depicts the monthly dividend payment for a family of 4 in $2012. By 2035, when the cost of living has increased by roughly 2% for most regions, a family of four would be receiving nearly $400 per month in dividend payments. To get a sense of how you would fare under this proposal, just ask yourself this. Would I agree to have all of my bills increase by 2% in exchange for a check of $400 per month? For the vast majority of us, the answer is a resounding yes. After all, even if you spend $10,000 per month, a 2% increase is only an extra $200 per month, which pales in comparison to a $400 per month dividend check. Now let's look at jobs. Here we see how the proposal would impact the number of jobs in each region. The West North Central region would gain a little less than 300,000 jobs by 2035 as a result of the carbon fee and dividend proposal, and the Mid-Atlantic region would gain a little more than 300,000 jobs. Some of the jobs would be in the energy sector, especially in wind energy, but many would result from increased consumer spending caused by the dividend. So the new jobs come in all sorts of areas, including many in construction, because people spend more on buying and improving houses when they have more money, and healthcare, because people spend more taking care of themselves when they have more money. The only region that loses jobs is the West-South Central, which sees a small net loss as a result of disappearing jobs in oil and gas. So, to return to our main question, what would the dividend accomplish? The dividend would improve the U.S. economy significantly, increasing total real personal income, labor's share of income, and the total number of jobs by over 2 million in the next 20 years. Next, consider how the border adjustment would reduce foreign emissions of greenhouse gases. We can consider this issue by exploring three questions. What is a border adjustment? What border adjustment does CCL propose? And what would the border adjustment accomplish? What is a border adjustment? Here we have a steel factory in Nation A, a steel factory in Nation B, and the owners of each factory. Suppose that the factories are equally efficient, so they should be able to sell their products for the same price. But Nation A's ruler decides that he will subsidize steel production so that Owner A can now beat Owner B's prices. Owner A then has an unfair competitive advantage over Owner B. A border adjustment compensates for this kind of unfairness in two ways. First, when Owner A sends his steel to Nation B, the price is adjusted at the border by making Owner A pay the amount of the subsidy that his company received from his government to the government of Nation B. Second, when Owner B sends his goods to Nation A, his government pays him a border adjustment that's comparable to the subsidy that Nation A gives to its companies. The border adjustment ensures, then, that goods coming from A sell in B for what they would have sold for if A didn't unfairly subsidize its companies, and that goods coming from B sell in A for what they would have sold for if Government B offered the same subsidy as Government A. What border adjustment does CCL propose? In order to answer this question, we need to think about the border adjustment from the point of view of various players in the economy, specifically foreign manufacturers, U.S. manufacturers, U.S. retailers, and foreign retailers. Suppose that the U.S. adopts the carbon fee, but no other country does. The foreign manufacturer depicted here is a Nike factory in Vietnam. Based on the cost of producing its shoes, they plan to sell them in the U.S. to U.S. retailers for $50 per pair. If Vietnam had a carbon fee, the cost of production would have been higher, so they would have had to charge $51 a pair to make the same profit. But they don't have a carbon fee, and so they can plan to sell their shoes for $50 a pair. The border adjustment enters here. Uncle Sam collects $1 for each pair of shoes coming to the U.S. from the Vietnam factory. Accordingly, the shoes coming from Vietnam sell in the U.S. market for what they would have sold for if Vietnam had had a carbon fee, $51 per pair. Next, consider U.S. goods sold in foreign markets. The domestic manufacturer depicted here is a New Balance factory. Based on the cost of producing its shoes, they plan to sell them to UK retailers for $51 per pair. If the U.S. didn't have a carbon fee, the cost of production would have been lower, so they would have charged $50 per pair to make the same profit. But the U.S. has a carbon fee, and so they plan to sell the shoes for $51 a pair. The border adjustment enters here once again. Uncle Sam pays New Balance $1 for each pair of shoes exported from the U.S. factory to the UK. Accordingly, the New Balance shoes sell in the UK market for what they would have sold for if the U.S. had no carbon fee, $50 per pair. Consequently, Vietnamese factories don't get an unfair competitive advantage over U.S. manufacturers in the UK market. What does the border adjustment accomplish? Without a border adjustment, the carbon fee gives foreign manufacturers a competitive advantage over U.S. manufacturers, so all retailers would do better to buy from foreign manufacturers. But with the border adjustment, U.S. manufacturers are exactly as competitive as they would be if the U.S. had no carbon fee, so retailers won't prefer one over the other because of the carbon fee. So, the carbon fee doesn't give foreign manufacturing competitive advantage over US manufacturing. This is important because otherwise the carbon fee would incentivize companies to manufacture outside of the US, which would hurt US manufacturing and interfere with achieving emission reductions. But how would the border adjustment reduce foreign emissions? In order to answer this question, we need to think about the adjustment from the point of view of foreign governments. Here we have the government of Vietnam and their representative, Mrs. Ruler. She sees Uncle Sam collecting money from her manufacturers when they export to the US. She's outraged, but when she complains, Uncle Sam notes that she can collect the money herself if she institutes a carbon fee of her own. Mrs. Ruler, then, decides to implement a carbon fee of her own. As this example suggests, the border adjustment incentivizes any nation whose companies sell goods in the US to adopt a carbon fee comparable to whatever fee we adopt, so that they can collect money for themselves that they would otherwise pay to the US government through the border adjustment. The US imports far more than any other nation, and we import a lot from the largest polluters, such as China and India. So the large polluters have strong incentive to adopt a carbon fee if we do. Moreover, the REMI findings suggest that any large diverse economy, including that of India and China, would benefit economically from adopting CCL's carbon fee and dividend. So they have further incentive to adopt a carbon fee if we do. We should expect, then, that if we adopt a carbon fee, it would spread around the world. As we have seen, a carbon fee would cause a drastic reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases if it were implemented in the US. It would work the same for any further countries that adopt it. So, we should expect that if we adopt a carbon fee, then foreign emissions of greenhouse gases would drop drastically. Finally, consider why the law should appeal to both Republicans and Democrats. To start, consider why the law should appeal to Republicans. There are many reasons, but we'll consider three. First, anyone who values the efficiency of free markets should support a carbon fee. Second, anyone who values personal responsibility should support a carbon fee. Third, the law would benefit the US economy and compel other nations, including China and India, to follow our lead. Why should those who value the efficiency of free markets support a carbon fee? To start, notice that markets become inefficient when companies can escape some of the costs of producing their product by dumping those costs onto society. Consider an example. Here we have Mr. Cheat, who runs a factory. The factory produces various goods that have toxic waste as a byproduct. What does Mr. Cheat do with the toxic waste? Being Mr. Cheat, he dumps it into a nearby river. Consequently, disposal costs him nothing at all. Here we have three people, brown, pink, and green, who rely on the river's clean water for their livelihoods. They are forced to pay, or get the local, state, or federal government to pay, to clean up the river in order to continue running their businesses. The money they pay should be part of the cost of production for Mr. Cheat, but it isn't. Consequently, he can sell his products for less than he would be able to in an efficient market. Consequently, people will consume more of his product than they would if it were priced appropriately. This is a severe market inefficiency. You can see the inefficiency by noting that any competitor of Mr. Cheat who disposes of her waste properly will have a higher cost of production than Mr. Cheat does, and thus will be forced to sell her goods for more than Mr. Cheat, even if her business is more efficient. This inefficiency should anger anyone who values the efficiency of free markets. Accordingly, they should support measures to return markets to balance. Specifically, they should demand that Mr. Cheat pay to clean up the river. Consider the carbon fee in light of this. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which harms people. How does it harm people? Here are three examples. The first involves snow. Excessive carbon in the atmosphere heats lakes that should be frozen throughout the winter. So, when storms blow across these lakes, they pick up extra moisture, so they dump more snow. So because of carbon emissions, governments pay more for snow removal from city streets. Businesses pay more for snow removal from their properties, and homeowners either pay more for snow removal or shovel more snow themselves, and so on. The second example involves hurricanes. Excessive carbon in the atmosphere warms the surface temperature of the world's ocean, which melts polar ice caps, which adds volume to the world's oceans. So, when hurricanes hit the shore, they push more water further inland, which causes flooding that destroys city streets, houses, subways, and so on. So, because of carbon emissions, governments pay more for infrastructure repair and homeowners pay more for insurance, and so on. The third example involves rains. Excessive carbon in the atmosphere makes rainfall heavier whenever it happens, but less frequent, which, at best, makes farming cost more and at worst destroys crops. So, because of excessive carbon emissions, the government pays farmers more through crop insurance, and farmers lose money as their expenses increase. Although assessing particular cases is hard, we know that burning fossil fuels causes many of these harms. But fossil fuel companies don't pay for these harms. We pay. From the point of view of market efficiency, fossil fuel companies are exactly like Mr. Cheat. They force us to pay for their cost of production, rather than paying it themselves. This makes the energy market highly inefficient because people consume more energy produced by fossil fuels than they would if the price reflected the full cost of production, and competing energy sources that don't cause similar harms are less competitive than they would be in an efficient market. This should anger anyone who values the efficiency of free markets. Accordingly, they should demand that fossil fuel companies pay for the harms caused by their products. That's what a carbon fee does, and it does so in the only way that keeps markets functioning properly. So, anyone who values the efficiency of free markets should support a carbon fee or similar measure. Next, consider why anyone who values personal responsibility should support a carbon fee. We have just seen that presently fossil fuel companies don't pay for the harms they cause. Accordingly, they fail to take responsibility for the ramifications of their actions. The same holds for all of us. People who consume a lot are more responsible for climate change than people who consume a little. This heavy consumer lives in a mansion in the suburbs, has multiple cars, lots of clothes, and so on. Living his life requires a lot more energy than living the life of this light consumer who lives in a row home in the city and uses mass transit. Yet presently, neither pays for the harms that her consumption does. Accordingly, neither takes responsibility for the ramifications of her actions. A carbon fee forces energy companies and consumers alike to pay for the harms they do. Energy companies pay directly through the fee. Consumers pay indirectly through rising prices, and they pay to the extent that they consume, which is to say, to the extent they are responsible for harms. The carbon fee, then, forces everyone to take responsibility for his actions. Notice that this point holds even if we set aside the harms caused by climate change. Remy found that by 2035, CCL's carbon fee would prevent over 200,000 premature deaths from respiratory and other health problems caused by coal dust and other pollutants related to fossil fuel consumption. Now let's consider how CCL's proposal withstands objections that Republicans often level against taking action on climate change. To be clear, many Republicans want action on climate change. These are, nonetheless, objections that one often hears from Republican politicians. Here are the most common objections and why they are irrelevant given CCL's proposal. First, some Republicans object that any law or policy that would reduce emissions significantly would harm our economy. But we have seen that contrary to this objection, implementing CCL's proposal would benefit our economy significantly. For, thanks to its dividend, implementing CCL's proposal would, among other benefits, increase real incomes, increase labor share of income, increase GDP, and add millions of jobs to the economy over the next 20 years. Second, many Republicans object that acting alone makes no sense because we won't be able to reduce emissions if China and India don't follow, and acting alone would give China and India a competitive advantage in markets throughout the world. But we have seen that, contrary to this objection, implementing CCL's proposal would compel other nations, including China and India, to follow our lead. For, thanks to the border adjustment, CCL's proposed law would force other nations to choose between collecting a carbon fee themselves and paying that fee to us. Because of the border adjustment, moreover, no nation gets a competitive advantage over the US by refusing to adopt a carbon fee of its own. Neither standard objection, then, applies to CCL's proposal. CCL's proposal, then, should appeal to Republicans because the carbon fee would make markets more efficient and ensure that people take responsibility for harms they do rather than socializing the cost of those harms. And the border adjustment would compel the world's largest polluters, including China and India, to follow our lead, and the carbon dividend and border adjustment together would ensure that our economy benefits, regardless of what other nations do. Why should CCL's proposal appeal to Democrats? Democrats overwhelmingly support reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the carbon fee ensures the drastic reduction in emissions that the overwhelming majority of Democrats want. Democrats often express concern that policies designed to limit emissions will be especially hard on the poor and middle class. But the dividend ensures that the poor and middle class aren't harmed economically as we reduce emissions. In fact, because they spend less than the average amount spent, they come out significantly ahead. We should adopt CCL's proposed law, then, because the carbon fee would reduce domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. The dividend would improve the domestic economy. The border adjustment would reduce foreign emissions of greenhouse gases, and the entire package should appeal to both Republicans and Democrats. CCL's law would move us away from a dangerous world toward a much better world, and do so in a way that advances both conservative and liberal values. What more could we want? For further information, please visit citizensclimatelobby.org.